The triumph of Herbert Hoover. Poker-faced Calvin Coolidge, the tight-lipped Sphinx of the Potomac, bowed out of the 1928 presidential election when he announced, "I do not choose to run." His logical successor was Super Secretary Herbert Hoover, unpopular with the political bosses but the much-admired darling of the masses. Who asked, who but Hoover? He was nominated on a platform that chucked contentedly over both prosperity and prohibition. Still squabbling Democrats nominated Alfred E. Smith, four-time governor of New York and one of the most colorful personalities in American politics. He was a wisecracking, glad-handling liberal who suffered from severe, fatal political handicaps. Alcohol Smith was soakingly and drippingly wet at a time when the country was still devoted to a noble experiment of prohibition. To a nation that had only recently moved to the city, native New Yorker Smith seemed to abrasively urban. He was a Roman Catholic and overwhelmingly Protestant and unfortunately prejudiced land. Many dry, rural, and fundamentalist Democrats gagged on his candidacy, and they saddled the wet Smith with a dry running mate and a dry platform. Jauntily sporting a brown derby and a big cigar, Smith, the happy warrior, tried to carry alcohol on one shoulder and water on the other, but his efforts was doomed from the start. Chubby-faced, ruddy complexion Herbert Hoover, with his painfully high starched collar, was a living example of the American success story and an intriguing mixture of two centuries. As a poor orphan boy who had worked his way through Stanford University, he had absorbed the 19th century copybook maxims of industry, thrift, and self-reliance. As a fabulously successful mining engineer and a brilliant businessman, he had honed to a degree the efficiency doctrines of the progressive era. A small-town boy from Iowa and Oregon, he had traveled and worked abroad extensively. Long years of self-imposed exile had deepened his determination, abundantly supported by a national tradition. To avoid foreign entanglements, his experience abroad had further strengthened his faith in American individualism, free enterprise, and small government. With his unshaken dignity and Quaker restraint, Hoover was a far cry from the typical backslapping politician. Though a citizen of the world and laden with international honors, he was quite shy, standoffish, and stiff. Personally colorless in public, he had been accustomed during much of his life to giving orders to subordinates and not soliciting votes. Never before elected to the office, he was thin-skinned in the face of criticism, and he did not adapt readily to the necessarily give and take of the political accommodation. His real power lay in his integrity, his humanitarianism, his passion for assembling the facts, his efficiency, his talents for the administration, and his ability to inspire loyalty and close associates. They called him the Chief. As befitted Americans' newly mechanized civilizations, Hoover was the ideal business person's candidate. A self-made millionaire, he recoiled from anything suggesting socialism, paternalism, or planned economy. Yet as Secretary of Commerce, he had exhibited some progressive instincts. He endorsed labor unions and supported federal regulation of the new radio broadcasting industry. He even flirted for a time with the idea of government-owned radio similar to the BBC. As bands blared Smith's theme song, The Sidewalks in New York, the campaign sank into the sewers beneath the sidewalks. Despite the best efforts of Hoover and Smith, below-the-belt tactics were employed to a disgusting degree by the lower-level campaigners. Religious bigotry raised a hideous head over Smith's Catholicism. An irresponsible whispering campaign claimed that a vote for Al Smith is a vote for the Pope, and that the White House under Smith would become a branch of the Vatican, complete with rum, Romanism, and ruin. Hoover's attempts to quash such rumors were in vain. The proverbial solid South, 100% American, and a stronghold of Protestant KKKism shield away the city slicker. Al Smith might have accepted a Catholic or a wet or a descendant of Irish grandparents or an urbanite, but a concoction of Catholicism, wetism, foreignism, and liberalism brewed on the sidewalks of New York was too bitter a dose for Southern stomachs. Smith's theme song was a constant and rasping reminder that the upbringing had not been convincingly American. Hoover triumphed in a landslide. He bagged 21,391,993 popular votes to 15,116,169 for his embittered opponent, while rolling up an electoral count of 444 to 87. A huge Republican majority was returned to the dry Southern Democrats. Hoovercrats rebelled against Al Smith, and Hoover proved to be the first Republican candidate in 52 years, except for Harding's Tennessee victory in 1920 to carry a state that had seceded. He swept 5 states of the former Confederacy as well as the border states. President Hoover's first moves. Prosperity in the late 1920s smiled broadly as the Hoover years began. Soaring stocks on the bull market continued to defy the laws of financial gravitation, but 2 immense groups of citizens were not getting their share of the riches flowing from the national cornucopia: the unorganized wage earners and especially the disorganized farmers. Hoover's administration, in line with its philosophy of promoting self-help, responded to the outcry of the wounded farmers with legislative aspirin. The Agricultural Marketing Act, passed by Congress in June 1929, was designed to help the farmers help themselves, largely through producers' cooperatives. It set up the Federal Farm Board with a revolving fund of $500 million at its disposal. Money was lent generously to farm organizations seeking to buy, sell, and store agricultural surpluses. In 1930, the Farm Board itself created both the Grain Stabilization Corporation and the Cotton Stabilization Corporation. The prime goal was to bolster sagging prices to buying up surpluses, but the 2 agencies were soon suffocated by the avalanche of farm produce. As wheat dropped to 57 cents a bushel and cotton to 5 cents a pound, farmers had meanwhile clutched at the tariff as a possible straw to keep their heads above the waters of financial ruin. During the recent presidential campaign, Hoover, an amateur in politics, had been stampeded into a politically unwise pledge. He had promised to call Congress in a special session to consider agricultural relief, specifically to bring about limited changes in the tariff. These hopes giving assurances no doubt won many votes at Hoover in the Midwestern Farm Belt. The Holly Smooth Tariff of 1930 followed the well-worn pattern of Washington horse trading. It started out in the House as a fairly reasonable protective measure designed to assist the farmers, but by the time the high-pressure lobbyists had pushed it through the Senate, it had acquired about 1,000 amendments. It thus turned out to be the highest protective tariff in the nation's peacetime history. The average duty on non-free goods was raised from 38.5% as established by the Forney-McCumber Act of 1932 to nearly 60%. The Great Crash ends the Golden Twenties. When Herbert Hoover confidently took the presidential oath on March 4, 1929, there were few black clouds on the economic horizon. The long boom seemed endless, with the painful exception that the debt-blanketed Farm Belt. America's productive colossus, stimulated by the automobile, radio, movies, and other new industries, was roaring along at a dizzying speed and suggested a permanent plateau of prosperity. Few people sensed that it might be smoother in its own fires by pouring out too much. The speculative bubble was actually near the bursting point. Prices on the stock exchange continued to spiral upward and create a fool's paradise of proper profits. Despite Hoover's early but fruitless efforts to curb speculation through the Federal Reserve Board, few prophets of disaster were bold enough to sound warnings, but were drowned out by the mad chatter of the ticker-tape machine. The catastrophic crash came in October 1929. It was partially triggered by the British, who raised their interest rates in an effort to bring back capital lured abroad by American investments. Foreign investors and wary domestic speculators began to dump their insecurities, and an orgy of selling followed. Tension built up a panicky Black Tuesday of October 29, 1929, when 16 million shares of stocks were sold in a save-who-may scramble. Wall Street became a wailing wall as gloom and doom replaced boom, and suicides increased alarmingly. A sick joke of the time had hotel room clerks ask reentrants for sleeping or jumping. Losses, even in blue-chip securities, were unbelievable. By the end of 1929, 2 months after the initial crash, stockholders had lost $40 billion in paper values, more than the total cost of World War I to the United States. The stock market collapse heralded a business depression at home and abroad that was the most prolonged and prostrating in American or world experience. No other industrialized nation suffered so severe a setback. By the end of 1930, more than 4 million workers in the United States were jobless. 2 years later, the figure had about tripled. Hungry and despairing workers pounded pavements in search of non-existent jobs, whereas employees were not discharged wages and salaries were often slashed. The misery and gloom were incalculable, as forests of dead chimneys stood stark against the sky. Over 5,000 banks collapsed in the first 3 years of the Depression, carrying down with them the life savings of tens of thousands of ordinary citizens. Hooked on the horn of plenty. What caused the Great Depression? One basic explanation is overproduction by both farm and factory. Ironically, the Depression of the 1930s was one of abundance, not want. It was the Great Glut, or the Plague of Plenty. The nation's ability to produce goods had clearly outran its capacity to consume or pay for them. Too much money was going into the hands of few wealthy people, who in turn invested it into factories and other agencies of production. Not enough was going into salaries and wages, where revitalizing purchasing power could be more quickly felt. Other maladies were at work. Overexpansion of credit through installment plan buying overstimulated production. Paying on so-called easy terms caused many consumers to drive beyond their path. Normal technological unemployment resulting from new labor-saving machines also added its burden to the abnormal unemployment of the thoroughbred 30s. This already bleak picture was further darkened by economic anemia abroad. Britain and the continent had never fully recovered from the upheaval of World War I. Depression in America was given a further downward push by the chain reaction financial collapse in Europe. Following the failure in 1939 of a prominent Vienna banking house, a drying up of international trade, moreover, had been hastened by the short-sighted, highly smooth tariff of 1930. European uncertainties over reparations, war debts, and defaults on loans owed to America most tensions that reacted unfavorably to the United States. Many of these conditions had been created or worsened by Uncle Sam's own narrow vision policies, but it was now too late to unscramble the omelet. As if man-made disasters were not enough, a terrible drought scorched the Mississippi Valley in 1930. Thousands of farms were sold at auction for taxes through this, though in some cases kind neighbors would intimidate prospective buyers, bid 1 cent, and return the property to its original owner. Farm tenancy or rental, a species of peonage, was spreading at an alarming rate among blacks and whites. By 1930, the Depression had become an international calamity. Though no fault of their own, a host of industrialist citizens had lost everything. They wanted to work, but there was no work. The insidious effect of all this day's despair on the nation's spirit was incalculable and long-lasting. America's uniqueness no longer seemed so unique, or its manifest destiny so manifest. Hitherto, the people had grappled with storms, trees, stones, and other physical obstacles, but the Depression was a baffling wrath that they could not grasp. Initiative and self-respect were stifled, as panhandlers begged for food or charity soup. In extreme cases, ragged individuals slept under Hoover blankets, fought on the contents of old garbage cans, or cooked their findings in old oil drums of tin paper shanty towns cynically named Hoovervilles. The very foundations of America's social and political structure trembled. Rugged times for rugged individuals. Hoover exalted reputation as a wonder worker and efficiency engineer crashed about as dismally as the stock market. He doubtless would have shone in the prosperity-drenched Coolidge years, when he had foreseen the abolition of poverty and poorhouses, but damning the Great Depression proved to be a task beyond his engineering talents. The perplexed president was impaled on the horns of a cruel dilemma. As a deservedly famed humanitarian, he was profoundly distressed by the widespread misery about him. Yet as a rugged individualist, deeply rooted in an earlier era of free enterprise, he shrank from the heresy of government handouts. Convinced that industry, thrift, and self-reliance were the virtues that had made America great, President Hoover feared that a government doling out doles would would weaken, perhaps destroy, the national fiber. As the Depression nightmare steadily worsened, relief by local government agencies broke down. Hoover was financially forced to turn reluctantly from his doctrine of log cabin individualism and accept the proposition that the welfare of the people in a nationwide catastrophe is a direct concern of the national government. The president at last worked out a compromise between the old hands-off philosophy and the soul-destroying direct dole that had been used in England. He would assist hard-pressed railroads, banks, and rural credit corporations in hope that if financial wealth were restored at the top of the economic pyramid, unemployment would be relieved at the bottom on a trickle-down basis. Partisan critics sneered at the great humanitarian who had fed faraway Belgians but would not feed the funds to feed needy Americans. Hostile commentators remarked that he was willing to lend government money to big bankers who allegedly had plunged the country into a mess. He would likewise lend the money to agricultural organizations to feed pigs, but not people. Pigs, the cynics of the time noted, had more character to undermine. Hoover battles of the Great Depression. President Hoover, in line with his trickle-down philosophy, at last recommended that Congress vote immense sums for useful public works. Though at heart an anti-spender, he secured from Congress appropriations totaling $2.2 billion for such projects. Most imposing of the public enterprises was the gigantic Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. Voted by Congress in the days of Coolidge, it began in 1930 under Hoover and completed in 1936 under Roosevelt. It succeeded in creating a huge man-made lake for purposes of irrigation, flood control, and electrical power. But Hoover sternly fought all schemes that he would regard as socialistic. Conspicuous among them was the Muscle Shoals Bill, designed to dam the Tennessee River and ultimately embraced by Franklin Roosevelt's Tennessee Valley Authority. Hoover empathetically vetoed this measure primarily because he opposed the government selling electricity in competition with its own citizens and private companies. Early in 1932, Congress, responding to Hoover's belated appeal, established a Reconstruction Finance Corporation. With its initial working capital of $500 million, this agency became a government lending bank. It was designed to provide indirect relief by assisting insurance companies, banks, agricultural organizations, railroads, and even hard-pressed state and local governments. But to preserve individualism and character, there would be no loans to individuals from this billion-dollar soup kitchen. Pump priming, loans by the RFC, were no doubt of widespread benefit, though the organization was established many months too late for maximum usefulness. Projects that it supported were largely self-liquidating, and the government as a banker actually profited to the tune of many millions of dollars. Giant corporations so obviously benefited from the assistance that the RFC was dubbed, rather unfairly, the millionaire's dole. The irony is that the thrifty and individualistic Hoover had sponsored the project, though with initial reluctance it actually had a strong New Dealish flavor. Hoover's administration also provided some indirect benefits for labor. After a stormy debate, Congress passed the Norris-LaGuardia Anti-Junction Act in 1932, and Hoover signed it. The measure outlawed yellow dog contracts and forbade the federal courts to issue injunctions to restrain strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing. The truth is that Herbert Hoover, despite criticism of his heartliness, did not inaugurate a significant new policy. In previous panics, the masses had been forced to sweat it out. Slow though Hoover was to abandon his 19th century bias, by the end of his term he had started down the road towards government assistance for needy citizens, a road that Franklin Roosevelt would travel much farther. Routing the bonus army in Washington. Many veterans of World War I were numbered among the hard-hit victims of the Depression. Industry had secured a bonus, though a dubious one, in the Hawley-Smoot tariff. So the thought of the former soldiers naturally turned to what the government owed them for their services in 1917 and 1918, when they had saved a democracy. A drive developed for the premature payment of the deferred bonus voted by Congress in 1924 and payable in 1945. Thousands of impoverished veterans, both of war and unemployment, were now prepared to move on Washington, there to demand of Congress the immediate payment of their entire bonus. The Bonus Expeditionary Force, which mustered about 20,000 souls, converged on the Capitol in the summer of 1932. These supplicants promptly set up unsanitary public camps and erected shacks on vacant lots, a gigantic Hooverville. They thus created a menace to the public health, while attempting to intimidate Congress by their presence in force. After the pending bonus bill had failed in Congress by a narrow margin, Hoover arranged to pay the return fare of about 6,000 bonus marchers. The rest refused to decamp, though ordered to do so. Following riots that cost 2 lives, Hoover responded to the demands of Washington authorities by ordering the army to evacuate the unwanted guests. Although Hoover charged that the bonus army was led by riffraff and Reds, in fact, only a sprinkling of them were former convicts and communist agitators. The eviction was carried out by General Douglas MacArthur with bayonets and tear gas, and with far more severity than Hoover had planned. A few of the former soldiers were injured as the torch was put to their pathetic shanties in the inglorious Battle of Anacostia Flats. An 11-month-old bonus baby allegedly died from exposure to tear gas. This brutal episode brought down additional abuse on the once popular Hoover, who by now was the most loudly booed man in the country. The Democrats, not content with Hoover's vulnerable record, employed professional smear artists to drive him from office. Cynics sneered that the great engineer had in a few months ditched, drained, and damned the country. The existing panic was unfairly branded the Hoover Depression. In truth, Hoover had been oversold as a wizard, and the public gambled when his magician's wand failed to produce rabbits. The time was ripening for the Democratic Party and Franklin D. Roosevelt to cash in on Hoover's calamities. Hoover pioneers the good neighbor policy. Hoover's arrival in the White House brought a more hopeful turn to relations with America's southern neighbors. The new president was deeply interested in the often troubled nations below the Rio Grande. Shortly after his election in 1928, he had undertaken a goodwill tour of Latin America on a U.S. battleship. World depression softened an age-old aggressive attitude in the United States towards weak Latin neighbors. Following the stock market collapse in 1929, Americans had less money to invest abroad. As millions of dollars worth of investments in Latin America went sour, many Yankees felt as though they were more preyed upon than preying. So-called economic imperialism became much less popular in the United States than it had been in the Golden 20s. As an advocate of international goodwill, Hoover strove to abandon the interventionist twist given to the Monroe Doctrine by Teddy Roosevelt. In 1932, he negotiated a new treaty with the French-speaking Republic of Haiti, and this pact, later supplemented by an executive agreement, provided for the complete withdrawal of American platoons by 1938. Further pleasing omens came early in 1933 when the last Marine Leatherneck sailed away from Nicaragua after an almost continuous stay of some 20 years. Herbert Hoover, the engineer in politics, thus happily engineered the foundation stones of the good neighbor policy. Upon them rose an imposing edifice in which the days of his successor, Franklin Roosevelt.